Everyone blames 2022. The war, the sanctions, the isolation, that's the story you've heard. But Russia's space program was already broken years before a single sanction hit. And the reason has nothing to do with an invasion, it has to do with something Roscosmos was doing at the exact same time it claimed to be self-sufficient. There's a financial relationship at the centre of this story that Roscosmos never once mentioned in public. Not with a rival, with a partner. It ran for decades through administrations on both sides that called each other adversaries, out loud, and depended on each other in private, long after the point where either side could pretend that dependency didn't exist. By the time you understand what that partnership actually was, everything else in this video, the corruption, the failed landings, the empty launch pads, is going to read differently, not as separate stories, as symptoms of the same disease. Picture the Soviet space program at its peak. Between 1957 and 1991, the USSR launched into orbit 2,760 times. More than double the United States, which managed 1,221 launches in the same window. This wasn't a space race, it was a landslide. Rockets went up so often that individual launches barely made the evening news inside the country. Space was routine. Space was proof of something larger. A demonstration running in the background of everyday Soviet life, the way a factory whistle marks a shift change. Whatever else was breaking inside the Soviet system in those decades, the rockets kept going up. Compare that to 2024. Russia's state launch providers, Roscosmos and the Defense Ministry combined, managed 17 launches for the entire year, a fraction of what the same country used to fly in a single busy month. Put another way, Russia's entire 2024 launch total was fewer than SpaceX alone completed in about 6 weeks. China did 66. The United States, driven almost entirely by one private company, did 145. Russia's share of the world's orbital launches had fallen to roughly 7%. 15 of those 17 launches used variants of the Soyuz rocket, a design that traces its lineage back to the 1960s. Only 2 used Angara, the newer rocket meant to eventually replace it, a program that has itself been in development since the 1990s without ever reaching a real production tempo. Angara was first announced as Soyuz's eventual replacement back when the technology being replaced was still considered modern. It has now outlived that justification by roughly 3 decades, and Russia is still flying the older rocket for the overwhelming majority of its launches, because the newer one was never funded or tested at the pace its own timeline promised. Now here's the detail that gets skipped in almost every article written about this. That 17 launch number wasn't a wartime collapse. Analysts who track global launch data found that Russia's 2024 and 2025 cadence was, in their words, slightly ahead of its 2018 launch totals. The same rate. Before the war, before most of the sanctions, the war didn't cause this number. It arrived to find the number already sitting there, waiting, unchanged. So, if the invasion isn't the reason, what is? Whatever it is, it has to be big enough to explain a decade of decline, quiet enough that most coverage never connected it, and it has to have started at home, inside Russia's own program, not somewhere in Washington or Brussels. Roll the clock back further. Before 2016, Russia was routinely launching more than 30 rockets a year. Something changed in the years leading up to 2016, years before Crimea escalated into a full invasion, years before Western companies pulled out, years before any of the headlines you've actually read on this topic. Something was already eating the program from the inside. And it wasn't a foreign government doing it, it was Vostochny. In 2011, Russia broke ground on a brand new cosmodrome in its far east, a facility meant to end its dependence on the Baikonur launch site it had been renting from Kazakhstan since the Soviet collapse. Putin called it a national priority, a symbol of a self-sufficient Russia that no longer needed to launch its own cosmonauts from another country's soil, paying rent for the privilege. The government allocated 91 billion rubles to build it, roughly $1.4 billion. What actually happened to that money is where this story turns from geopolitics into something closer to a heist investigation. The Kremlin's own estimate, at least 11 billion rubles, about $172 million, was stolen during construction. 58 people were sentenced to prison. One man, Yuri Kryzman, the former head of the company running construction, personally cost the state 5.2 billion rubles on his own, nearly a quarter of the entire theft. He got 11.5 years. His son Mikhail, also involved in the scheme, got 5.5. A regional deputy named Viktor Chudov got 6. Prosecutors found more than 17,000 building code violations on site and opened over 140 separate criminal cases. Of the $172 million confirmed stolen, less than a third was ever recovered. Walk the site today and the numbers stop being abstract. Vostochny was supposed to be a fully modern launch complex on par with Baikonur, on par with Cape Canaveral. Construction crews worked through Far Eastern winters on a facility that kept missing its own deadlines by years at a stretch, while workers went unpaid for weeks at a time and staged protests over it, on camera, on a project the Kremlin was simultaneously calling a point of national pride, a contradiction nobody in the government ever tried very hard to resolve. This is the part worth sitting with. Vostochny wasn't a single scandal. It was a pattern that kept repeating on the same construction site with different names attached for the better part of a decade. In 2020, 2 more officials were arrested in a fresh embezzlement and bribery scheme, years after the first wave of major sentences had already been handed down, proving the earlier convictions hadn't actually changed anything about how the site operated. One of them, the head of the state entity operating the Cosmodrome, was accused of bribing a Defense Ministry inspector with a job offer worth 500,000 rubles a month for both the inspector and his wife, in exchange for falsified safety reports on unfinished water supply facilities. In 2014, before any of the biggest sentences were even announced, Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin stood at the site and threatened, in his own words, to rip the heads off the people responsible. He said it publicly. He said it more than once, on more than one visit, years apart, to reporters who kept showing up expecting a different answer each time and getting the same one. The theft kept happening anyway under his watch and after it, regardless of who held the title. That's not one villain making one bad decision. That's a system where stealing from a national space program carried less real risk than the reward, no matter how many heads got threatened in press conferences. And theft alone still doesn't explain why the same institution kept making the same choice, year after year under different people with different amounts of money on the table. This wasn't just stolen construction money either. It was money that was supposed to buy Russia real independence from outside help. Because that independence never actually arrived, the program kept leaning harder on the one relationship it insisted. In public, it had already outgrown. We'll get to exactly what that relationship was. First, you need to see how far the concealment went. Here's where the story usually stops for most channels covering this. Corruption, theft, a shrug, roll credits. But that misses the more interesting question. Why did nobody catch it faster? Why did a program funded and run entirely by the state have less financial accountability than a mid-sized private company answering to shareholders? 17,000 violations don't happen on a site with real oversight. They happen on a site where oversight exists mostly on paper. The answer sits inside a different incident 4 years before the Vostochny arrests peaked. One that had nothing to do with money at all and everything to do with what an institution does the moment something goes wrong on camera. In August of 2018, a 2mm hole appeared in the wall of the Soyuz MS-09 spacecraft, docked to the International Space Station. Air pressure started dropping overnight. The crew traced it to a small hole in the orbital module and patched it with epoxy and gauze. Cosmonaut Sergei Prokopiev sealed it himself, mid-mission, with materials meant for far less serious repairs than a hull breach 250 miles above the Earth. Roscosmos investigated, and what they found should have been a straightforward engineering story. Photos of the hole showed drill marks, the unmistakable pattern of a bit that had skipped across the surface before catching and digging in. This wasn't a micrometeoroid, this was a tool in someone's hand, at some point before that spacecraft ever left the ground, or possibly after it reached orbit. Instead of naming the technician, Roscosmos' director, Dmitry Rogozin, floated a different theory publicly. Sabotage. He didn't rule out that a member of the crew, meaning specifically the NASA astronaut on board, may have drilled the hole herself, in orbit, in zero gravity, with tools that weren't hers. Russian state media ran with it for months. Officials requested polygraph tests on the American crew and were refused. NASA's own surveillance footage showed no American crew member anywhere near the Russian segment of the station when the pressure drop began. NASA called the accusation baseless and stood publicly behind its astronaut. The claim was never substantiated by a single piece of evidence, then or since, and it is still technically unresolved on paper. Here's the detail that actually matters, and it isn't the drill hole, it's what happened a year later. In September of 2019, Rogozin admitted something in public that ended the entire sabotage narrative outright, almost in passing, buried in a longer statement about something else. Roscosmos knew who caused the hole. They had known for some time, and they were choosing not to say who it was. A space agency that spent the better part of a year implying an American astronaut had jeopardized the International Space Station knew the whole time that wasn't true, and let the accusation sit in anyway rather than admit the failure was theirs. Space policy expert John Logsdon at George Washington University called it evidence of a deeper problem, a documented decline in quality control across the Russian space industry, one where a defect made on the ground could reach orbit undetected and, worse, go unreported once it was found and understood. Blaming an ally for a year, then admitting you knew better the whole time and saying nothing, is an institution protecting its own image instead of fixing its own process. A technician's mistake is the drilled hole. What Roscosmos did for the 12 months after is something else entirely, and only one of those two failures was ever fixable. Call it a pattern, not a coincidence, because it repeats. It happened again, less dramatically, in the winter of 2022 into 2023. A Soyuz crew capsule sprang a coolant leak in December, spraying fluid visibly into space in view of external cameras. Roscosmos blamed a micrometeoroid strike. 2 months later, in February, a separate Progress cargo ship sprang a nearly identical leak from a 12mm hole in its external radiator. Roscosmos again pointed to an external impact, ruling out a manufacturing flaw after inspecting its own factories. Maybe that's exactly what happened twice, back to back on 2 different ships built at 2 different times. Or maybe external impact had simply become the default answer, the one that required no internal investigation and assigned no internal blame. The practical cost of that first leak wasn't abstract either. 2 cosmonauts and a NASA astronaut who were supposed to come home in March ended up staying on the station until September, their 6-month mission stretched to nearly a year, because the spacecraft meant to carry them down safely couldn't be trusted at the temperatures the leak had created. First, the problem was money going missing on the ground. Then it was an institution that would rather blame an ally than admit an error. By 2022, the question wasn't whether Roscosmos had a concealment habit anymore. It was whether the people living inside its spacecraft were now the ones exposed to it. The International Space Station's Russian-built Zvezda module has been dealing with small air leaks and surface cracking since 2019. Cracks that Russian officials have stated publicly are the result of metal fatigue from age and repeated stress cycles, not any single dramatic event. The leak rate has climbed as high as 3.7 pounds of air a day during its worst stretches, enough that NASA's own safety advisors flagged it as a growing concern years before the war started, and have used language as serious as catastrophic failure in describing the worst-case scenario. This isn't a design failing after a deadline nobody tracked. It's a decades-old design philosophy, patch and continue, applied to a module that was never meant to still be flying this long without a genuine overhaul. So if it isn't the hardware failing on its own, and it isn't one bad batch of engineers, what's actually driving all of it year after year, incident after incident? The answer isn't in any single failure, it's in where the money and attention went instead, long before any of these specific machines were ever built. Roscosmos wasn't just running human spaceflight and science missions, it was also responsible for GLONASS, Russia's answer to GPS, along with military communication and surveillance satellites, and Plesetsk, a second launch site dedicated to defense. GLONASS needs a minimum of 18 operational satellites to function as a full global network. By the mid-2020s, Russia was maintaining around 25, aging hardware that regularly outlived its expected service life before replacements were ready. Military and intelligence satellites got funded first, almost automatically because they answered to a different chain of command, with different priorities than exploration ever had. Everything else at Roscosmos competed for whatever was left over, and by the 2020s, what was left over was not much. It lost again in a much quieter way, won most coverage of Russia's space program skips entirely. Before the war, Russia was negotiating to join NASA's Gateway, the planned lunar orbit station meant to support the Artemis program, the successor to everything the ISS partnership had built. Roscosmos wanted the same kind of arrangement it had on the International Space Station, an equal partnership with political weight given the same priority as technical contribution. NASA didn't accept those terms. Russia was effectively excluded from Gateway years before Ukraine on the basis of what it could actually deliver, not on the basis of politics. The country that once landed the first human in orbit couldn't negotiate its way into the next one, and the reason given wasn't sanctions, it was capability. Every thread so far explains a piece of the collapse. None of them explains why Russia stayed this dependent for this long without ever admitting it in public. By the time that relationship becomes fully visible, Roscosmos stops looking like a superpower's space agency and starts looking like a contractor with one client it never named out loud. For that, you have to go back to the one relationship this entire video opened with. Now remember the partnership from the start of this video, the one Roscosmos never once admitted to needing. NPO Energomash, the company that builds Russia's rocket engines, pulled roughly half its annual revenue from a single customer, the United States. Selling the RD-180 engine that powered the Atlas V rocket, the same rocket the Pentagon used to launch military and spy satellites into orbit. Not a symbolic sale, not a leftover Cold War courtesy contract, half of one company's entire annual income for 2 decades, from the government Roscosmos spent the same 2 decades publicly positioning itself against. This deal ran from the mid-1990s until Russia itself cancelled it in March 2022, not the other way around. Even after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, even after the first waves of sanctions, the deliveries kept going. Rogozin himself argued publicly in 2018 that continuing the exports was necessary, saying plainly that Russia depended on selling engines to the United States, as much as the United States depended on buying them. That's an official admission of mutual dependency, on the record, from the man running the agency. When Russia finally cut the deal off in 2022 in retaliation for its own invasion, it wasn't striking a blow against a rival space program. It was severing its own engine maker from roughly half its income voluntarily, as a political statement at the exact moment that revenue was needed most. Rogozin's public line when he announced the cutoff was that the Americans should, in his words, fly on their brooms instead. It played well on state television. It also ended a revenue stream that had funded half of Russia's own engine production for a generation, and no broom joke changed that math afterward. This is the shape of the real story, not a program that got sanctioned into collapse from the outside, and a program that had spent decades outsourcing its own financial stability to the country it was supposedly racing to outpace, while insisting in public at every press conference and every state broadcast that it didn't need the West at all. Every failure this video has walked through up to this point happened underneath that quiet arrangement, not despite it. Which brings us to the moon. In August of 2023, Russia launched Luna 25, its first lunar mission since the Soviet era, 47 years earlier. It was meant to demonstrate, after everything, that Russia could still land where it chose. During the final approach, the descent engine was supposed to fire for 84 seconds to nudge the probe into a pre-landing orbit. It fired for 127 seconds. The extra impulse threw Luna 25 onto an uncontrolled trajectory, and it crashed into the lunar surface near the South Pole it was supposed to be studying. Roscosmos confirmed the failure themselves, plainly without much room for spin this time. An anomalous engine burn, full stop, no external impact to point to. Mikhail Marov, a 90-year-old scientist who had worked on Soviet lunar missions decades earlier and stayed on the Luna 25 project into his final years, was hospitalized after the crash. It was, in his own words to Russian media, the work of his entire life, and his last real chance to see the program he had spent that life on return to the moon. Space historian Brian Harvey traced the deeper roots of that failure back to the 1990s, a period he calls chaos capitalism, when the entire Russian space program nearly folded under its own weight and very nearly stopped launching anything at all. He pointed to an earlier mission, Mars 96, as the clearest evidence of just how bad it got at the program's low point. Engineers finishing the spacecraft, in his own words, by candlelight in an unheated hangar in winter. Luna 25 was not a fluke 3 decades later. It was the same underfunded institution with somewhat better hardware, making the same category of mistake that underfunding always produces eventually. The kind of mistake that shows up in a rushed engine burn instead of a candlelit hangar, but comes from the identical place. None of this happened in isolation, and none of it happened because one bad leader took over at the wrong moment. Corruption at Vostochny predates Rogozhin's tenure at Roscosmos entirely, reaching back to a director before him and continuing under the one after. The Soyuz cover-up happened on his watch, but the instinct to protect the institution rather than name the failure didn't start with him, and didn't end when he left either. Different directors, different decades, the same reflex over and over, like a habit nobody in the building had the authority to break. That's a design feature of an institution built without real outside accountability, running on a state budget that shrank from roughly $3.4 to $3.9 billion at its peak, down to $2.8 billion by 2024, a little over 70% of what it used to have. And that shrunken budget still had to cover military launch facilities at Plesetsk, GLONASS satellite replacements that couldn't wait, an unpaid rent at Baikonur where Kazakhstan eventually seized Russian assets over the debt, a bill Russia simply stopped paying on schedule. Roscosmos itself has a name for what happened to its budget. Officials have called it restructuring, prioritization, a necessary refocusing toward core national needs. None of that is what it was. It was a funding cut, applied to an agency that had already proven it couldn't manage the money it used to have, dressed up in language that made a shrinking program sound like a strategic choice instead of a forced one. Call a wound a strategy long enough and you stop looking for the bleeding. And the people who might have fixed this from the inside were already leaving, long before anyone thought to ask them to stay. Surveys from the Boston Consulting Group covering 24,000 respondents found that 49% of Russian engineering specialists said they wanted to work abroad even before the full-scale invasion accelerated the exodus into something closer to a flood. Germany took the largest share of departing Russian talent, followed by Israel, then Switzerland. After 2022, more than 1.3 million Russians under the age of 35 left the workforce in a single year, according to reporting compiled by NPR. Not all of them engineers, not all of them scientists, but exactly the age group, exactly the education level that a space program spends decades training and then depends on to keep flying its next generation of hardware. Among those most likely to leave, surveys found a striking skew toward digital talent, artificial intelligence specialists, systems engineers, the exact skill set that modern spacecraft design increasingly depends on, more than welding or metallurgy ever did. A rocket built in 2025 is a flying computer with a fuel tank attached. Russia was losing the people who could have built the computer half. So here's where all the pieces land, together at the same time, none of them optional to the story. The decline started years before the war, while Russia was still publicly launching at what looked like Soviet-era ambition levels to anyone not checking the actual numbers. The money that should have built real infrastructure went missing at Vostochny instead, protected by a system built to survive scrutiny rather than reward transparency. That same system chose, at least twice, to protect its own reputation over telling the public the truth about its hardware. The country's entire engine program was never as independent from the West as it claimed in public, not for one single year of a deal that ran for 2 decades. And a station Russia once helped design, excluded it from the next one on capability grounds before the war gave anyone a political excuse to explain it away. None of these threads is dramatic enough on its own to explain a program's decline. A budget shortfall happens everywhere, corruption happens everywhere, engineers leave for better pay everywhere. What made Russia's case different is that every one of those ordinary pressures hit an institution with no functioning mechanism to correct itself, an agency that had spent decades treating public image as the thing worth protecting ahead of the hardware, ahead of the budget, ahead of the truth about either one. That ordering of priorities is the actual root cause underneath every individual incident in this video. The drilled hole, the stolen rubles, the failed landing are just where that root cause happened to surface first. In front of cameras it couldn't control. The war in Ukraine didn't kill Russia's space program. It removed the one partnership Roscosmos never admitted to needing in public. A partnership that had been propping up a system too corrupt and too closed to ever fix itself from the inside. Once it was gone, there was nothing left standing between the public and what had already failed years earlier in the dark.